In this video, we are ranking the top 30 wide receivers for fantasy football right now to help you exactly know who you should be targeting at the position. And we'll be breaking this down by tier, and it's going to start with our number one overall receiver, and that's CeeDee Lamb, who's still just 25 years old, and the Cowboys didn't really add any competition for him. I mean, we can look at what Dallas's wide receiver core is, and it's the exact same as last year. Brandon Cooks, who's now another year older, albeit he is having a good training camp right now, and then Jalen Tolbert is battling right now Jalen Brooks for the fourth or the third wide receiver job and the fourth job. None of those guys are uber threatening. They'll probably be, third, fourth option in the pecking order. So everything looks great for Lamb, who last year had over 180 targets, led the NFL in receptions, and now the Cowboys might even be throwing more this year as they didn't really add anything to their backfield. And Lamb put up all of that volume while also remaining extremely efficient, ranking top 5 in yards per route run last season. And this fella, CeeDee Lamb, was used absolutely everywhere. You could see he led the NFL in red zone targets, so used in the most important area of the field for fantasy, scoring touchdowns, giving you that extra boost, and then also downfield, his deep target to 20 plus yards. He was 14th overall, which is pretty impressive considering how much overall volume he was using, picking up a lot of targets on the underneath, but also able to win downfield and in the red zone. Now, the second wide receiver, and we're still in tier 1 here, is going to be Tyreek Hill, and honestly, if you want to have him number 1 overall at the position, I can't really blame you. But there are a couple of main disadvantages that Tyreek has, at least when you're comparing him to CeeDee Lamb. Tyreek is a bit older at 30 years old, and he's competing with another top 20 receiver in Jalen Waddle. Now, despite being a tad older, it really hasn't affected him all that much. He had 10.7 targets per game, actually not even all that much at all. 10.7 targets per game last year, led the NFL in target rate. So this is how many routes he was running, how often he was targeted on those. 37% of the time when he ran a route, he was targeted, number 1 in the NFL. He led the NFL in yards per route run. He was as efficient as it gets. So yeah, the age really isn't showing, at least not yet. And to take it another step even further, Tyreek earned to his first read target 38% of the time, which was top 5 in the NFL. Compared to Jalen Waddle, the other top 20 receiver on this team, who only earned it 15% of the time. That's how wide of a difference there was between these two guys. So Tyreek's in tier 1, and now we actually go to tier 2. There's only 2 guys in tier 1 for me. That's a lot of numbers, but it's Justin Jefferson, my wide receiver 3 overall. And look, he's probably the best overall receiver in the NFL. His $140 million contract shows that, so this is no slight to his skill set. And now last season, some people might say, oh, he let me down. Well, Jefferson battled an injury, a hamstring injury, which has been derailing a lot of players over the past couple of years. Just look at Christian Watson. It made him miss 7 games. So that's probably why you're annoyed with Justin Jefferson if you drafted him last season. But when he was out there, he was still great because the fellow was still averaging 10 targets per game, up there with the best of the best in the NFL. 107 yards per game would have been like top 3 in the NFL, and 4th in yards per route run. So the efficiency was there. It was just a hamstring injury. These things happen for wide receivers. He seems to be over it right now, but why is he in tier 3? Well, he no longer has Kirk Cousins out there, and that's going to be a major issue because the quarterback situation isn't as stable as what you have for Tyreek and CeeDee Lamb. Instead, it's going to be a new quarterback, either Sam Darnold, who hasn't given us a lot of reasons to be excited right now, leading the team in OTAs, or the first-round rookie JJ McCarthy, who we cannot just assume automatically is going to step in and put up the exact same production that Kirk Cousins was when he was leading the NFL in passing last year before injury. So that's why Justin Jefferson is dropping for me. Now let's go to the number 4 wide receiver. And that takes us to Ja'Marr Chase, my number 4 receiver in tier 2. And I actually really like him this season. Honestly, a lot more than I have in past seasons for a few reasons. First off, as of right now, Joe Burrow is trending to be healthy for training camp, the preseason, and week 1, which every other year in the NFL he wasn't. Whether he was coming back from a torn ACL, an injury last year in camp, coming into the NFL a little bit banged up, he's never had a full off season. So that's good because the offense should be able to click and be way more efficient right from the start instead of like a month into the season the past few years. And then the other piece is Tyler Boyd, the veteran slot receiver, is gone, and he's been replaced by a 3rd-round pick, Jermaine Burton, out of Alabama, who I think is a talented player, but probably going to see a lot more of his usage on the outside, which means Ja'Marr Chase should be slid into the slot a decent amount more, giving him more of the field to work with, a worse cornerback that he'll face, and overall, he should be able to pile on more targets. I mean, we've seen this with other elite wide receivers, even as recent as Amon-Ra St. Brown the past couple of seasons, Keenan Allen in the past, these guys who can work on the inside and out, but when they're in the slot, they pile on more targets, yards after the catch, and production. So I wouldn't be shocked if we see Ja'Marr Chase clear 150 targets this year, and obviously he can threaten for the number 1 overall wide receiver spot. And speaking of Amon-Ra St. Brown, we stick in tier 2 here with my wide receiver 5, and that is St. Brown, who, here's the deal, week 13 of his rookie season. Since then, Amon-Ra has 9+ targets or a touchdown in 92% of his games. That is an insane 35 of 38 games, either having 9 or more targets or a touchdown. And that's why he got his massive extension this offseason. He collected the bag. He just knows how to earn targets. And now he's going to enter his 4th year in the NFL, more experienced than ever before, and he's keeping his offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson, because look, the Lions made it to the NFC Championship. Teams couldn't poach away Johnson as easily, so now the same offense is coming back. Which means you could see a similar role for Amon-Ra St. Brown, meaning that when they go into 3 wide receiver sets, which will be often, he's going to get a lot of slot usage. He saw the 5th most snaps out of the slot, like we were talking about with Ja'Marr Chase. This is where Amon-Ra St. Brown, especially especially because he's a bit of a slower wide receiver, at least relative to a guy like Ja'Marr Chase. This is where he makes his money, in the slot, because it allows him to pile on yards after the catch and easy receptions. So Amon-Ra is a great player, and now we'll go to a wide receiver who's honestly a totally different build. And that will be A.J. Brown, who's just a different build than any receiver really, outside of like maybe DK Metcalf and a couple other guys, these big, fast wide receivers. He enters tier 2 for me, and look, some people might have some questions, but I disagree. Look, if you don't want to draft A.J. Brown, I get it, but he does have a chance to finish as the number 1 overall wide receiver, which might seem crazy, but that's exactly what he was doing at the first half of the year last season. And that's despite playing with another talented receiver in Devonta Smith and mobile quarterback in Jalen Hurts, who picks up a lot of production with his legs. Now, here's the deal. We've just seen him in Philadelphia pile on targets, 146 targets, 158 targets, earning these targets depending on the time of year, downfield, middle of the field, short area targets if teams start playing a lot more 2 wide receiver sets. But from the first 9 games of the season last year, there was honestly no one better than A.J. Brown. He was averaging 10.1 targets, 112 yards, and 22.6 fantasy points per game. The only guy you can argue was better was Tyreek Hill, and it was by like a fraction of a point per game in fantasy. But if you took out the first 2 weeks of the season when A.J. Brown and the overall offense took a couple weeks to get going for Philadelphia, and you go from week 3 to week 9, it was by far and away A.J. Brown every week producing like 125 plus yards, was a number 1 receiver during that time. Now, this didn't hold up as the season went on because the second half of the year, the wheels just fell off for Philadelphia. They started to get some injuries. The offense just struggled immensely. Devonta Smith had a couple of big weeks as more attention was shaded to A.J. Brown. But that overall ceiling is still there as we enter 2024. Now let's move to tier 3 with my number 7 wide receiver, and that's going to be Puka Nacua. And look, he's probably the one player in this top 10 rankings that gives me a little bit of concerns and the most questions. Now, this might seem a little bit ridiculous because his first year in the NFL, he did basically what no other player has ever done with almost 1,500 receiving yards. The guy was a monster after the catch. He had 105 receptions, was breaking all of the records for receptions, receiving yards, targets, yards after the catch for a rookie receiver. And now he's entering his second year at just 23 years old and still has a great coach in Sean McVay and is solid at 2, great quarterback in Matthew Stafford. And Puka earned the first read from Matthew Stafford, getting a target right away. That's the guy he looked to right away, 30% of the time, which was 14th best in the NFL. So what's the issue? Well, the issue is Cooper Kupp, and some people might roll their eyes, especially if you spent like a first, second, or third round pick on him last year when he dealt with a lot of injury. But Cooper Kupp last season earned the first read target share for Matthew Stafford 29% of the time, basically the same amount as Puka Nacua. It was them 1A, 1B as who Stafford would look to and throw the ball to first, and that is a little bit of a concern if you're taking Puka Nacua right now where he goes as a top 12 overall player in the first round for a lot of people. And what makes this even more concerning is when you look at the 12 games when Cooper Kupp was in the game last year, you can see that PPR, points per game, 15.7 for Puka Nacua and 8.3 targets. When Kupp was out, he was averaging 22 fantasy points per game and 11.6 targets. Drastic differences, and this makes sense when a great player and a high volume player like Kupp is out of the lineup, but here's the deal. If Puka Nacua was to average around 15, 16 fantasy points per game this year, I mean, and that's PPR points, by the way, it would be even less for half and standard. That's not going to be worth a top 10 overall pick where he goes right now. So I'd rather have A.J. Brown, who goes after Nacua right now in drafts. Now we'll go to my number 8 receiver. We're still in tier 4 here, and this is, or tier 3 here, and this is going to be Garrett Wilson, who, look, if his quarterback stays healthy and Aaron Rodgers this year, you're probably looking at an easy top 10 finish at the position. And I know it's not as simple as that, but let's just look at what he's done his first 2 years in the NFL. 147 targets, 168 targets, and yeah, he didn't have a ton of target competition like Elijah Moore for the most part, maybe Breece Hall out of the backfield last year at times, but his quarterback play was atrocious. Zach Wilson, Joe Flacco, Tim Boyle, Mike White, that's what he's been dealing with and still able to earn high target shares, and honestly, his competition this year isn't anything of a significant upgrade from past years. I mean, if you're comparing it to like Randall Cobb and Allen Lazard, then yeah, it's a significant upgrade, but it's still Mike Williams coming off of a torn ACL approaching 30 years old, and a third-round rookie in Malachi Corley, who I'm excited about, was kind of this gadgety yards after the catch type player in college, can be their slot receiver, can be interesting, but probably not going to be someone who threatens a 100-target season. So as long as Aaron Rodgers stays healthy, even off of a torn Achilles, even after getting a little bit older, I would still rather have that version of Aaron Rodgers and more catchable targets from him than any of the other quarterbacks we listed. Now we go to my number 9 wide receiver, and this is going to be Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. Him being a top 10 receiver is a little bit of a projection, of course, because of the new situation and might seem crazy. But we have to keep in mind that a lot changed this offseason. The big news right here, the additions, as you can see on the team changes page on the Fantasy Blueprint, you can get it down below, join thousands of others. It's risk-free this year. They got Kirk Cousins. That's the biggest upgrade. It's not Desmond Ridder. It's not Marcus Mariota like past seasons. It's not Taylor Heineke. No, it's a massive upgrade to Kirk Cousins and a new offensive coordinator in Zach Robinson. Now, maybe we're overblowing this. Maybe Cousins off the Achilles injury isn't going to be as good. Maybe Zach Robinson, his first time as an offensive coordinator, won't be as great as everybody's expecting him to be, a pass-friendly coach coming over from some other organizations. So we don't want to get too crazy here, but the fact that he had a run-first coach in Arthur Smith last year, who was a run-first offensive coordinator with the Titans in the past, and their personnel and quarterbacks kind of forced them to run the ball even more, and now that's changed, well, there's some reason to actually be hopeful. And that's why I do like Drake London. Even though he's going pretty early right now, he currently goes in drafts as the 23rd overall player, as you can see in the fantasy blueprint right here. He's my 15th overall player. I have him close to a first round pick right now. I'm 8 spots ahead of the market. I do think he's a pretty solid option and definitely a top 10 receiver for me right now. And now if Drake London doesn't have you a little bit nervous, this next guy might, because he's a rookie. And that man's name is Marvin Harrison Jr. And a lot of people will be a little bit worried about him being a top 10 receiver and a second round pick in fantasy, because people will say, oh, he's never played a down in the NFL before. And I understand that, but you can't just say that for every single rookie. First off, he was absolutely great at Ohio State with 2 different quarterbacks competing with other first round wide receivers. And each year when he actually started for 2 seasons, over 1,200 yards, despite everybody putting all of their attention on him, and like 30% target shares, 12 touchdowns. And not only that, but this guy was taken with a top 5 overall pick in the NFL draft. Wide receivers who go that early with a top 10 pick, not even just a first round pick, a top 10 pick, are paying off more often than not. Some people will say, oh, Corey Davis. Some people will say, oh, John Ross. But Marvin Harrison doesn't profile out like those guys. He profiles out more like the guys like Jamar Chase, Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, these elite level wide receivers. You could take it a step further and say Amari Cooper, AJ Green. These are the types of players that his profile, his build, his production looks like, not John Ross, these downfield speedsters. And then his competition outside of a third-year tight end and Trey McBride, not much here. Second-year player Michael Wilson, a middle-round pick. Zay Jones, who I do think is talented, but not going to threaten for an elite wide receiver share. And as much as the Cardinals want to make Greg Dortch sound like an amazing player if he was 6'3", he's not 6'3". He's a solid slot wide receiver. He's shown these little bursts of efficiency and productiveness when nobody else is out there on the team. But now that Marvin Harrison and Alpha is there, I think this guy can definitely threaten a 30% target share and easily finishes a top 10 receiver as long as he stays healthy. Now we head over to tier 4, and this is where things start to get a little bit tricky, and it's going to start with Chris Olave from the Saints, because we're kind of getting this hodgepodge of guys who go in like round 2 or round 3 of the drafts, and honestly, none of them look all that great. But the good news is that Chris Olave is the clear wide receiver 1 on this team with a bullet, and the team didn't add all that much new competition, because it's still Rashid Shaheed, who I think is a talented player, might have a big year. It's still A.T. Perry, his second year as a late round draft pick. They added a free agent in Cedric Wilson. Okay, not much there. They drafted a 5th rounder out of Pittsburgh in Bub Means. Okay, maybe he could threaten for like a wide receiver 3 role, probably not even that. So it's Chris Olave with the bullet as the number 1 option here, as he mostly competes with A.T. Perry, Rashid Shaheed, and tight end Juwan Johnson, although he already has a surgery, I believe, an injury that's going to keep him out for some time in training camp. This is the same target competition that he had last year when he averaged almost 9 targets per game with Derek Carr, and now there's a new offseason to work with, a new offensive coordinator as well in Clint Kubiak, which maybe leads to some more yards after the catch opportunities. Kubiak comes from the 49ers, who focus on that in the Shanahan offense. That could help that could help the extra production for Chris Olave in theory. Now, my concern would be that this offensive line was sketchy last year. They haven't done overwhelmingly a lot this offseason. That makes it look like it won't be, maybe average is the goal this year. And if that's the case, well, if Derek Carr is under pressure, it could lead to just some bad things this season. So we need a better offensive line for Carr to work behind, because he's not good under pressure. Next up is my wide receiver 12, and it's the man who is just inevitable. It's Mike Evans, who this offseason signed a well-deserved 2-year extension. And despite turning 31 years old, you might have some concerns like, oh, now that he got it, probably his final bag in the NFL, is he going to be motivated? Well, I'm not too worried about that about Mike Evans. The guy's always been stand-up. All he does is produce. Last year, despite being 30 years old now, he ranked number 11 in EPA. Okay, you don't really like EPA. Well, yards per route run, a pretty significant stat for wide receiver efficiency. Still has it. 13th in the NFL. Shows he can get open. Shows he can produce after the catch, and was the guy last year. Now, your main concern is that there's a new offensive coordinator in Liam Cohen here, and Dave Canales, the offensive coordinator from last year, is gone. So how does that mostly affect Baker Mayfield? Is he still going to be able to be put in the same situations to succeed like he was last year with Mike Evans? That is a concern. But Evans is still a top 12 receiver for me, and now my wide receiver 13 is going to be Malik Nabers, the rookie for the Giants out of LSU, a first-round pick, a top 10 pick like we talked about Marvin Harrison, how often those guys hit, and Malik Nabers is in a similar mold as those types of great players. I'm way ahead on the market right now. He goes as the wide receiver 24. Again, he's my wide receiver 13. And look, everybody is taking Marvin Harrison as a clear-cut second-round pick, a top 10 receiver, but Malik Nabers is pretty similar. These guys were thought to be very similar by a lot of scouts coming out. One went 4th overall, one went 6th overall. You had Malik Nabers last year being a little bit younger than Marvin Harrison, posting better efficiency stats, barely putting up over 1,500 yards. And now he comes into the NFL with arguably less competition, because Harrison has to deal with Trey McBride, who seems to be a playmaker. There's no other playmakers on this Giants team now with Darren Waller and Saquon Garden. Wan'Dale Robinson, short area guy. Darius Slayton, maybe a downfield threat. He's still trying to re-sign his contract. Jalen Hyatt, a downfield threat, not going to threaten for a 100-plus target season most likely. So I'm trusting Brian Daboll. I know Daniel Jones is there, and that's the big concern, but I'm trusting Brian Daboll to put his main playmaker in a position to win often with Daniel Jones, even if that means a little bit more slants rather than these outside post routes that are harder for Daniel Jones to complete. So I am very bullish right now on Malik Nabers. My 24th overall player goes 47th overall, so I'm 2 rounds ahead on Nabers. That does not mean draft him 2 rounds early. necessarily. It means when you're approaching that 3rd and 4th round, just know that he looks like a really good value. Doesn't mean you have to overdraft him by any means. I don't see why he can't, if he stays healthy, threaten for 130 plus target season in his rookie year. Now, my next wide receiver in tier 4 is going to be Brandon Aiyuk, and I know there's a lot of speculation like he might be traded because he recently put out a somewhat cryptic and direct tweet, or it was a TikTok. And this was the video, if you're not familiar with it. He's talking with his former quarterback from college in Jaden Daniels. Yes, they played together, I believe, at Arizona State when they both were there a while ago now, like 5 years ago. And he's basically saying this quote right here: "They said they don't want me anymore, but here's my take on it." Obviously, he knows he's putting out this video. This is just a negotiation tactic, in my opinion. Right here, I say, from my vantage point, why else are you releasing this to your own personal? It's not like this was leaked by somebody else recording over his shoulder. He was releasing this to his own personal Instagram or TikTok, which is just basically what, to me, looks like a negotiation tactic. Try and get the media and the fan base on your side for some form of leverage. And maybe it wasn't all that deep and he was just having fun with it and he wanted to cause a friendly, but there was some thought in his head when he clicked upload, like, obviously I know what I'm doing here and I know what this is going to cause. I just think it's difficult for them to trade him at this point. It would kind of just be weird that they didn't trade him before free agency in the draft, when they would have got the most value for him for a team right now that has Brock Purdy on a cheap deal and is trying to go back to the Super Bowl. Now, what makes it hard to put Brandon Aiyuk higher, and also guys like Deebo Samuel higher, is the fact that there's just a lot of competition here. Obviously, Deebo Samuel's on this team. Now they have a first-round receiver in Ricky Pearsall. Juwan Jennings is going to get his reps as a run blocker. Those guys obviously aren't going to threaten the target share that much. Deebo will. There's George Kittle still there. And then, of course, the guy who just got re-signed in Christian McCaffrey, he's going to threaten for the most usage on this overall team when you factor in targets and carries. So it makes it a little bit hard. Obviously, if he has a good touchdown season, Aiyuk can finish as a top 10 receiver, but we can say that about anybody in this range. Now, before we get into my number 15 wide receiver, and this guy might make some people a little bit uneasy, I want to let you know about the Fantasy Blueprint. Now, here's the deal, fellas. If you want to beat your coworkers, your friends, whatever it might be, I think the Blueprint is going to help you do that for sure. It's helped thousands of people already do that. You just click this link, and then it'll take you to a page where we have multiple options. These 2 partner options, as well as a 3rd option down here if those don't work for you for some reason, to get the Fantasy Blueprint absolutely risk-free. It's pretty simple. The steps are all laid out for you. Now, what does risk-free means? It means if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, I'll just refund your minimum deposit of $10. No questions asked. So you either make your playoffs and make a push for the postseason, which will give you tools every single week to do, or you get your $10 back and there was just no risk at all in the process. So risk-free, you can just get it by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description below. A few thousand people already have it. You can get yours now as well. We remain in tier 4 here with my wide receiver 15, and it's going to be Nico Collins, who I believe is the true X-wide receiver for the Texans at just 25 years old in his prime, now attached to one of the best young quarterbacks in the league in CJ Stroud. Everything came together last year for Collins. Obviously, CJ Stroud helped, but he started to produce not only deep, but in the intermediate parts of the field as one of the most efficient receivers in the NFL. Nico ranks 2nd in wide receiver efficiency and 5th in first downs per route run, and these are probably the 2 best stats that predict future success and how good a wide receiver is right now. He's in his prime. Now, obviously, the target competition is going to come into play. If Stefon Diggs can return the clock from a couple years ago and not last year, then that's going to make it hard for Nico Collins to finish as a top 20 receiver. You still have Tank Dell there, but honestly, worst case scenario, I think Nico Collins is this good in his prime as the primary X receiver on this team that his floor is like wide receiver 24 if he stays healthy, where his upside is a top 5 wide receiver in the league if CJ Stroud in this offense continues to pass the ball more and take another step forward. So I'm fine taking him or ranking him as my number 15 receiver. Now, one guy I feel a little bit suspect about is my wide receiver 16 as we start tier 5, and it's Davante Adams. Look, the dude is still a stud. Let me begin by saying that. This doesn't have to do with his skill set, because Davante Adams last season, despite being over 30 years old, led the entire NFL with a first read target share of 40%. 40% of the time his quarterback looked at him first and threw him the ball. And this was while having some competition. You had Michael Mayer, a 2nd-round tight end, producing. You had Jacoby Myers, one of the most consistent fantasy receivers last year, week to week, producing. So it's not like he was doing it with no competition. But the reason that it's a big concern this year is this was like the only team, the Raiders, that somewhat didn't upgrade their quarterback room. Like the Broncos got Bo Nix. Some other teams, obviously the top teams in the draft, like Washington got Jaden Daniels. All they did was get Gardner Minshew, who in my opinion has a weaker arm than Aiden O'Connell. I think it will definitely be a camp battle between these two. So can we really trust the passing attack? Especially when we know this team wants to run the ball. That's what they're built for. They drafted a tight end in the first round in Brock Bowers. They're probably going to put a lot more 2 tight end sets out there, meaning they're going to emphasize the run game more, maybe the short passing, maybe the tight end targets. Because their coach Antonio Pierce has been very vocal that they want to play defense and run the ball, which again, with these quarterbacks and the way that your coach wants to play, is just shaping up to not be the best offensive environment for Adams. And wide receiver 16 feels like appropriate for me, but then I see he goes 16th overall, not just at the position, at every single position. He's going as a 2nd round pick, an early early second round pick still in drafts. I view him as probably an early third round pick right now, so I'm about a round later on Davante Adams. I'm just not drafting him over some of the other guys that we've already talked about. Now, I'm also not getting a lot of my wide receiver 17 in drafts. Like, this range is a little bit weird for me, like your aging wide receivers, and this is Deebo Samuel, who's not as old as Davante Adams, but it's just tough for me to get there. One-on-one, he's a one-of-one, incredible talent. He knows how to pick up yards after the catch, but here's the deal. It's just hard for me to like the wide receiver 2 in an offense led by Brock Purdy when we know Christian McCaffrey is there, George Kittle is going to have his blow-up weeks, and of course, Ayuk is the wide receiver one we already talked about. Now, I know Deebo finished as a top 12 receiver last year, and a lot of this had to do with the rushing production. He only had 6 targets per game, so he can do it. We've seen that he can do it. He had 7 touchdowns, which is above his average, but I think that rushing production is going to drop. We saw that happen towards the end of last year. He's getting a little bit older as well, so that's not going to be helping him, and I'm sure he doesn't want to be taking on those hits. I guess the one way where he looks a lot better is if Brandon Ayuk actually gets traded, which seems unlikely, but maybe by the time you're watching this, he is. Well, then, yeah, Deebo Samuel would move up, but that would be accounted for because he'll start to get drafted earlier as well. So I'm not really there on Deebo, but I am there on Jaylen Waddle, who's my wide receiver 18, and honestly, if there's a guy we've talked about so far in this video that I might be too low on, and admittedly so, it's probably Jaylen Waddle at this point. I could likely move him ahead of Deebo and Davante Adams. That's probably it, though. Wouldn't want to put him ahead of the Brandon Ayuk and Nico Collins tier, because he's still the clear number 2 receiver in his offense, and that's probably going to continue to be the case when Tyreek Hill is out there earning a 30% target share, and this is a team that wants to be run heavy. And for what it's worth, they added Odell. Not really concerned about that. Odell is a lot older now, probably a locker room guy, probably a vibes guy, an experienced guy, going to see maybe 2-3 targets a game, most likely. But the talent for this guy in Jaylen Waddle is undeniable. He's played 3 years in the NFL, and we've just seen him be versatile and able to win in totally different ways. In his first year in 2021, we saw him win in the short area of the field. In his second year in 2022, we saw him win downfield, and then in 2023, he did a mixture of both. And here's the deal. If this guy can just have more than 4 touchdowns like he did last season, which was obviously the lowest of his career, you can see right here, even if this is just too higher at 6, well, then he's finishing as a top 20 receiver last year and pushing towards a top 15 finish, and this was with Tyreek Hill healthy. If Tyreek Hill misses anytime, then this guy is a week in and week out top 10 receiver, so maybe I should be having him a little bit up. Let me know in the comments where you would rank Jaylen Waddle. Next up is my wide receiver 19, and that's Devonta Smith, and honestly, he's in a very similar situation to Jaylen Waddle. He's the clear number 2 on his team since A.J. Brown is there, and honestly could be a number 1 on most teams. But there are definitely a few disadvantages for Devonta Smith compared to Waddle. Outside of A.J. Brown being there, there's a legit tight end in Dallas Goedert who can have targets, and Jonnu Smith is in Miami now, but not the same type of player in my opinion, and there's a mobile quarterback in Jalen Hurts who's going to pick up production on the ground as well as in the red zone with potential touchdowns, which just takes away a little bit more overall offensive production from your wide receivers. And for anybody that wants to say, oh, Devonta Smith, they want to be like the hipster, the trendy person, Devonta Smith's better than A.J. Brown. No, he's not. A.J. Brown earned the first read last year from Jalen Hurts 37% of the time. That was 6th best in the NFL when Devonta Smith was 25% of the time, which was 31st in the NFL. A really wide gap. So just a little bit more difficult to really see a full breakout year, but he's still a top 20 receiver. Now my number 20 receiver to close out the top 20 here is going to be Michael Pittman, who's been great since entering the NFL. He's a reliable target. He does stuff after the catch and just never misses games. Now Pittman got paid this offseason, a 3-year extension, credit to him. Maybe it brings up some questions of like motivation now that he got his first big contract after his rookie deal. I'm not too concerned about that and like his character, but you would have to say after you get like $100 million, it has to affect you somewhat, or maybe $70 million you got. But he's still working towards future contracts as a younger player. I think the one concern you could have here is that Anthony Richardson is back, who's a mobile quarterback, and he's going to run the ball a lot. He's going to steal targets or red zone targets away from Michael Pittman by just running the ball instead, compared to Gardner Minshew last year, who in the Shane Steichen offense was throwing these shorter passes that allowed Pittman to pick up yards after the catch more easily. So that's one fear for Pittman, that the overall targets and potential red zone targets go down. And then you have Josh Downs entering his second year, battled some injuries last year, but was great as a rookie. You have Adonai Mitchell battling for a wide receiver 3 spot on the outside with Alec Pierce, and this downfield receiver might just gel better with the big play upside of Anthony Richardson's arm for the bigger deep targets as opposed to Michael Pittman. So Pittman is still a top 20 receiver for me, but he goes as the 27th overall player, factoring in all positions. As you can see right here in the fantasy blueprint, we compare average draft position to my rank. He's my 36th overall player. I still think he's a 3rd round pick, just goes a little bit earlier than I would like compared to some of the other receivers that we're talking about here, and for that reason, I'm just not getting him as much. Again, if you like Pittman, he'll probably earn 130 plus targets if he stays healthy, and if you want to draft him and you like that security in the targets every week, although the situation has changed a little with the quarterback, well, go ahead and just take him then. Now, believe it or not, we're still in tier 5 here, and we're going to go to my wide receiver 21, DK Metcalf, who I believe is an absolute true alpha receiver for the Seattle Seahawks and can be for your fantasy team as well. He led the Seahawks with a first read target share of 28% last year. Again, that was more than guys like Tyler Lockett and first round pick JSN, and also DK Metcalf has always been a cheat code for fantasy. And the cheat codes, as I like to define them in fantasy, are your deep targets and red zone targets. He ranked 8th in that department last year, 3rd the year before. In the past 3 seasons has ranked top 5 overall in cheat code targets. And the reason why those targets are important are, well, if you're getting targeted downfield and in the red zone, it's going to lead to more big plays, more touchdowns, which spike fantasy production. Right now, he's my 38th overall player, right around where he goes in the blueprint. I think he's appropriately priced and one of the better picks in the 4th round of the drafts that you can have right now with just immense upside. I think he has legit top 10 to top 5 wide receiver upside if everything clicks in this new Ryan Grubb-led offense in Seattle. Now, fellas, I was digging into the stats, and believe it or not, right now, only 40% of people who watch these videos are subscribed. Nearly 60% don't subscribe, and I have a goal to get that number down to about 50-50. So if you are not subscribed, take 2 seconds to check and hit that button. It truly helps the channel out more than you know. Now, finally, we're out of tier 5 and into tier 6, and I want to put these 2 teammates on the board together. My wide receiver 22, Tank Dell, my wide receiver 23, and Stefon Diggs, and that's not the way that it's going right now. This might not seem bold to some of you. For a lot of you, it will seem bold because Dell is going 23 picks after Diggs right now in drafts. But I just want to put my chips on the younger player, who in his rookie year last year as a 3rd round pick when he was actually healthy and out there, which was a chunk of the season, was fantastic. He finished top 20 in points per game in his rookie season, while Stefon Diggs had one of his worst years. He's now 30 years old, one of his worst years in the last 6 to 7 years. And here's the thing. A lot of people are just expecting that Tank Dell's going to go into the slot because he's a smaller receiver. But he played 70% of the time on the outside last year, where Stefon Diggs might be the one who actually goes into the slot. And in this video, we've said that elite wide receivers going into the slot is a good thing, but I'm just not sure that Stefon Diggs is elite anymore. He might be, and if he is, well, then that's great. He'll finish higher, the Texans will be great, and that'll hurt Tank Dell, but he didn't show signs of that the last year to year and a half. And this is important because the Texans last year ranked just 25th in using 3 wide receivers, just 39% of the time. Bobby Slowick, their offensive coordinator, just didn't want to do it. Now, if you get Stefon Diggs and you have the personnel, probably this should increase, but how much is the big question here? Because if Diggs is in the slot, he'll come off the field a lot more than people are expecting. So I'm just betting on the younger player right now. And again, this doesn't mean you have to take Tank Dell 2 rounds earlier than where he goes. Just be aware that when that round is coming up, that he is that top priority probably in the round. Next up, we get T. Higgins, my wide receiver 24 in tier 6 here, and he's now attended training camp. He signed a deal. It was going to be the franchise tag for 1 year. Instead, no, he signed a 1-year contract. This is similar to what we saw from Saquon Barkley this year. These guys didn't want to be on the franchise tag. Instead, you get a 1-year deal, probably hit the market next season, but you get maybe a couple more $1 million, a couple more incentives added on. And you can see that this was recently reported by Adam Schefter, and this is good news because now you don't have to worry, oh, is he going to hold out? Oh, does that mean he might actually be a little bit more hurt because he's not participating in training camp, and maybe he pulls a hamstring if he's not out there sprinting or doing all these things, whatever it might be. All of that can be put to rest, and maybe you're concerned about last year he wasn't as great for you, but just keep in mind that this guy was suffering injuries last year. He had a rib fracture, then he had a hamstring strain. Then Joe Burrow went down when he came back from his hamstring, so it was just all over the place. And Burrow was hurt to start the season. That's why the offense started slow as well. But instead of remembering that wonky year last year, let's remember when he's actually been out there healthy with a healthy Burrow. In these games, he averages 14.1 fantasy points and 7.4 targets per game. And that production, 30% more production when Burrow is out there and they're both healthy, is enough for him to definitely be a top 24 receiver and honestly a value in drafts right now. Next up is my wide receiver 25, and that's going to be DJ Moore, who right now goes as like a 2nd or a 3rd round pick in fantasy drafts, but I think that's wrong. I'm 17 spots lower on him as I view him as a 4th round pick, and honestly, I can't believe other people don't either. Because so much has changed for this guy's situation. Yeah, he's coming off of a career year, but now he's going to have a totally different quarterback, and 1st round pick Caleb Williams should be better than Justin Fields, but still a little bit of an adaptment period to see if that's going to be the case, or just see if they're going to have the same connection as him and Fields did. And then the competition's much harder right now. You have Keenan Allen, who comes into this, led the NFL in targets per game last year, an older receiver, might be put into the slot, but still going to be out there and upgrade from what they had. And you have a top 10 overall pick, Rome Odunze, who just might by the end of the year be the best player on this team in terms of wide receivers. And now I don't think that that's likely, but I wouldn't be shocked if we get a world where Rome Odunze is a better talent than DJ Moore. He went earlier than him in the NFL draft. He's an elite talent, would have been the first receiver if you didn't have generational talents, quote unquote, in Malik Neighbors and Marvin Harrison in this draft as well. Like, DJ Moore had the 4th best first read target share in the NFL last year. He had no competition and Justin Fields was zoning in on him. That's going to be different now. He has competition and Justin Fields is no longer there. I might have said Keenan Allen had that competition. I meant DJ Moore. Can't remember what I said. I said so many names in this video, but I can remember that my wide receiver 26 is going to be Christian Kirk, who, look, Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones are both gone from this offense, making Christian Kirk in year 3 with the Jaguars the longest tenured starting receiver for Trevor Lawrence. And now the new competition that he'll have this year with Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones gone is Gabe Davis, who never really broke out in 4 years with the Buffalo Bills despite all the attention being on Stefon Diggs, and a 1st round pick in Brian Thomas Jr., who I think is extremely athletic, somewhat of a raw prospect, even though he's a 1st round pick in terms of route running. He definitely runs good routes, but a lot of his production in college, he just was so fast and athletic, he just ran by guys downfield. But the point being is those 2 guys in Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas are probably going to be outside receivers, letting Christian Kirk go into the slot, and I still do think he's in his prime, which gives us maybe that Amon-Ra St. Brown elite type usage, especially after after the catch. Now let's introduce and start our final tier, tier 7, with Cooper Kupp, who, look, like I mentioned earlier, was still able to earn 29% of the first read targets from Matt Stafford last year, despite dealing with all of the injuries and getting a little bit older. Now, who knows what's left of Cooper Kupp? Maybe the injuries will take over once again with this ankle. It's a chronic issue and everything looks bad. But I just trust Kupp's savviness, Matthew Stafford's mind meld with him, and the coach and Sean McVay's savviness as well to put him in situations to win. But even though I trust that, the concern is where he's going in drafts. He's still going as a third-round pick right now. I don't see that. If he falls into the late 4th, where I have him as my 49th overall player, that's where you can start to take him, the early 5th round more ideally. But as a third-round pick, no. All the other receivers we talked about, much better odds at that point that I want to be taking them to hit. Next up is my wide receiver 28. It's Amari Cooper, who quietly has been consistent since joining the Browns, despite his quarterbacks being Joe Flacco, Jacoby Brissett, and what's been left of Deshaun Watson in recent years. I mean, the dude last year was used as like this downfield receiver, 6th in deep targets, 13th in average target distance, was also great after the catch. And he was doing this probably in part because Joe Flacco just loves to throw the ball deep, but it just shows you, even at this age, there's versatility to Amari's game. He can win off the line of scrimmage with route running, or he can still win downfield with his speed and physicality. And this should only continue for Amari because the offensive environment really hasn't changed all that much. Yes, they added Jerry Jeudy. Okay, he'll battle Elijah Moore for spots in 2 wide receiver sets. They added an exciting rookie who in college at Louisville, Jamari Thrash, was pretty exciting, but again, not going to be threatened wide receiver 1 workload for Amari Cooper. It's a similar wide receiver core outside of the wide receiver 3 moving piece. Now, the obvious concern right now is, what is Deshaun Watson? If he can actually get back some of that juice when he was with the Houston Texans, well, we're looking at a potential top 10 receiver in Amari Cooper. But of course, that's a question mark, and that's why he goes as my wide receiver 28 right now. My wide receiver 29 is Zay Flowers. I'm honestly not getting a lot of him. He's entering year 2 right now with the Ravens. Should be the wide receiver 1 of this team, especially since there's no Odell there. But a lot of people are forgetting that Zay Flowers was a totally different receiver last season when Mark Andrews was healthy versus when he wasn't. Flowers averaged 17.4 points with Andrews out and just 11 points with Andrews active. And plus, we didn't see Zay Flowers work downfield at all. It was like these short to intermediate targets, some yards after the catch. Now, maybe Todd Monken in year 2 of this offense puts him in better spots to succeed downfield, but we've yet to see it. And now, rounding out the top 30 wide receivers with my wide receiver 30 is Marquise Brown of the Kansas City Chiefs. Signed a 1-year deal, mostly guaranteed, and I think he's one of the better 6th-round picks right now because he has a real shot to be Patrick Mahomes' number 1 option. And when I say number 1 option, I mean receiver. Obviously, Travis Kelce is still there, although he is getting older, but anytime that you're paired up with Mahomes and Andy Reid, as a talented receiver like Marquise Brown is, 4 straight seasons of 100-plus targets, has a 145 target season on his resume, that's good news. And now, even if you don't think that he's going to be the number 1 receiver, he's definitely going to be out there in 2 wide receiver sets to start the season because Rashee Rice is facing a suspension, and Rice profiles out more like a slot receiver the way he was used last year. It's probably going to be Xavier Worthy if he can win the job, a starting job in camp over like Kadarius Toney and Sky Moore. It's going to be him and Marquise Brown on the outside to start the season while Rashee Rice is serving suspension. So it's a nice offense to be in anytime you're with Patrick Mahomes on a team that ranked 3rd in neutral pass rate last year. It's a good spot for Marquise Brown. Now, these have been my top 30 wide receivers. And oh, by the way, we got our 100,000 subscriber plaque. Thank you all very much. You can see it in the background. I didn't think it would be in there that easily like that. Looks nice. Well, this is the top 30 receivers for fantasy football. If you want to see the top 30 running backs and also the breakout wide receivers, I'll put those 2 videos right here for you to choose from. For now, enjoy your day. Appreciate you. And if you're not yet already subscribed to the channel.